You know, when you look at a political map of the world, those solid black borders feel like incredibly permanent.
Oh, absolutely.
Like they were drawn by geology rather than, actual people. You see a country's outline, you read its history in a textbook, and you just think, okay, well, this is the definitive reality of what happened.
Right, it's just reality. But what if the map and the history book that explains it to you were actually weapons?
Yeah.
Because it completely upends how you interact with information.
Yeah.
You stop seeing a textbook as a record of facts, and you start seeing it as a piece of state infrastructure.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore a really fascinating, honestly, highly provocative concept. We're looking at how academic research and intellectual discourse can be weaponized.
Right, weaponized to maintain an empire.
Exactly, and to suppress a people's liberation. So we're looking at this through a very specific, intense academic paper. It's titled The Comprador Intellectual Mercenary Scholars as Instruments of Neocolonial Subjugation.
It's a heavy title.
It really is. And it focuses entirely on the Oromo people's struggle for self-determination against the Abyssinian Empire, which the paper identifies as modern-day Ethiopia.
Yeah, before we go any further, we really need to pause here for a second.
Yeah, definitely.
Because if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, wow, these are massive, politically explosive claims.
Oh, yeah.
And you would be right. So we need to make it incredibly clear that we are just mapping the architecture of this author's critique. We are not taking sides here.
Right. No such.
We aren't endorsing the viewpoints of this text, nor are we validating its historical claims as, like, absolute truth. Our goal is to strictly and impartially report on the arguments exactly as the original author presents them.
Spot on. We're just looking at the blueprints of this argument so we can understand the mechanics of what they call intellectual subjugation.
Exactly.
So to understand these mercenary scholars, the author targets, we really have to start with the physical empire the paper claims they're defending, right?
Right. You need the physical foundation first.
Yeah. And the paper takes us back to the late 19th century, to the Berlin conferences of 1884 and 1885.
The infamous scramble for Africa.
Exactly, the scramble for Africa. And usually, the narrative is that European powers sat in a room and just carved up the continent. But the author makes a really striking claim about Abyssinia here.
They really do. The text explicitly argues that Abyssinia, which the paper notes, adopted the quote-unquote fake and stolen name of Ethiopia much later in the 1950s.
Right.
It argues Abyssinia was not a victim of this European balkanization.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah, the author argues that Abyssinia was actually a partitioner. Yep. It was an active participant in the scramble for Africa. The paper states that the Abyssinian Empire militarily conquered the Oromo, who are described as the largest ethno-national group in the Horn of Africa, along with about 90 other ethno-nations.
Okay, so they're conquering all this territory. But how did they actually structure it? I mean, did they just put soldiers on every corner and call it a day?
Well, no, because soldiers aren't enough to build an empire, right?
Right.
You need an economic engine, or honestly, in this case, an economic trap.
A trap.
Yeah, the author describes the relationship between the Abyssinian state and the conquered peoples as a 𝐶𝐿 system.
𝐶𝐿.
Right, which they define biologically as obligate parasitism.
Wait, obligate parasitism? Like a parasite that literally cannot survive without its host.
That's exactly it.
How does that biological concept even apply to a state?
Well, the author implies that the Abyssinian Imperial Center just did not have the industrial or agricultural base to sustain itself. It could only survive by constantly extracting resources, labor, and wealth from the peripheries it conquered.
I see.
Particularly the Oromo. And the structural mechanism they used to do this on the ground was called the Naftanya system.
The Naftanya system,
Wow.
which the paper calls a land tenure system. But I want to get away from the dry academic phrasing for a second.
Sure.
What does the Naftanya system actually look like for, an Oromo person living through it at that time?
Okay, so imagine you are an Oromo farmer.
Okay.
Your family has worked a specific valley for generations. Under the Naftanya system, an armed settler from the Imperial Center just arrived.
Just shows up.
Just shows up. And the state has essentially granted this settler ownership of your ancestral land as a reward for military service.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so overnight, legally, you are transformed into a serf on your own property. You're now forced to hand over a massive percentage of your harvest to this settler just to be allowed to survive on the land you previously owned.
That is just devastating. So the state isn't just drawing a border, they are fundamentally re-engineering the daily survival of the people they conquered. It almost sounds like a colonial proxy franchise.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Like you have an indigenous power that is mimicking European expansionist tactics. Forced assimilation, massive land seizures, just to secure its own regional empire, while the Europeans are doing the exact same thing on a global scale.
The text actually uses a phrase very close to that. It calls them an indigenous proxy for Western imperial expansion.
Wow.
The Abyssinian project positioned itself as a peripheral colonial power. By mimicking those European administrative structures, they created the initial physical enclosure of the Oromo people.
Okay, so military conquest and economic traps establish the physical empire. You take the land, you take the harvest. But here is the massive question for me.
Yeah.
A military can conquer a territory, sure, but how does an empire sustain itself for over a century?
Right.
Because you can't keep a gun pointed at millions of people indefinitely. The cost of policing that would literally bankrupt the state.
And that is the pivotal transition in the paper's argument. You are moving from physical enclosure to ideological enclosure.
Ideological enclosure.
Because to cement those stolen lands and disparate identities into a single monolithic state that functions without constant rebellion, you need a narrative. You need the academy.
Right, and enter the mercenary scholar, or what the paper calls the comprador intellectual.
Yes.
The author claims these academics act as the cognitive arm of both the Abyssinian elite and Western neocolonialism. But let me push back on this terminology a bit because it's so loaded.
It is very loaded.
When the text says mercenary, I immediately picture some shady professor getting handed a briefcase of cash in a dark alley to write a fake history book. I mean, is it that crude?
No, it's far more insidious than a briefcase of cash.
Okay.
The paper defines mercenary as a structural and institutional alignment. It means an academic's research agenda, their theoretical framework, and their institutional allegiances perfectly align with maintaining the status quo of the empire.
Ah, okay. So it's not a direct bribe. It's the entire incentive structure of the academic world.
Yeah.
If you write a paper validating the quote-unquote one Ethiopia myth, you get published, you get tenure, you get invited to all the international conferences.
Precisely. They perform what the author calls discursive labor. It's a process of myth-making.
Myth-making.
According to the text, these scholars take the violent occupation and trauma of the late 19th century and they completely sanitize it.
How so?
They reframe it using academic terminology like unification, state building, or reintegration.
Which completely changes the moral foundation of the state.
Yes.
Think about the power of that vocabulary. If it's a conquest, the state is an occupier, right? And the people have a right to resist. But if a historian writes that it was a reintegration, suddenly the state is a peacemaker, bringing fractured pieces back together.
And that is the crux of the ideological enclosure. By providing that intellectual foundation, these scholars give the state the moral cover it needs to deny Oromo grievances.
Wow.
The scholars are essentially policing the boundaries of what is even considered legitimate political discourse.
So if these scholars are tasked with maintaining the empire's image, how do they actually do it on a practical level? Like when an Oromo elder tells the history of their people and an Abyssinian academic writes a completely different version in a textbook, how does the academic ensure their version wins?
Well, the paper outlines 3 specific modes of discursive violence, and they are incredibly methodical.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first mode the author identifies is the erasure of oral histories, which they term epistemicide.
Epistemicide, so the killing of a knowledge system.
Yes. The text argues that these scholars deliberately prioritize state-sanctioned written archives over Oromo collective memory, and they specifically focus on the erasure of the Gada system.
Let's pause on the Gada system because the paper treats it as absolutely central. This wasn't just like a cute cultural tradition, right?
Not at all. The Gada system was the indigenous socio-political framework of the Oromo.
Right.
It was a highly complex democratic system of governance.
With laws and everything.
Yeah, it had legislative assemblies, term limits, and structured successions of power. It governed every aspect of Oromo life.
So by erasing it from the historical record, you aren't just erasing a culture, you are erasing the proof that the Oromo were a sovereign, organized society capable of self-rule.
Exactly.
It's less like deleting a hard drive and more like taking all the family photo albums, diaries, and legal deeds out of a house, burning them, and then handing the children a state-issued biography of their parents.
That's a dark way to put it, but yeah.
A biography that tells them their parents were actually disorganized criminals who needed to be civilized. And over a few generations, the kids might start to believe the book.
That is a very accurate way to visualize the human impact of epistemicide. By invalidating those oral traditions and indigenous structures, the scholars basically dismantle the cognitive framework of the Oromo people to make room for an Abyssinian-centric timeline.
But what happens when the Oromo push back? Because people don't just forget who they are. Let's say they organize and advocate for liberation, which, by the way, the paper points out, is a right solidified by a 1960 UN declaration on granting independence to colonial countries.
Yes, the text emphasizes that.
So how do the scholars respond when literal international law is brought into the mix?
That triggers the second mode, which the paper calls pathologizing resistance.
What's pathologizing?
According to the paper, the mercenary scholars reframe that legitimate demand for self-determination as a disease within the state. They strip away the context of the UN declaration and instead use terms like tribalism, ethnic extremism, or foreign-instigated instability.
Man, it's like geopolitical gaslighting on a massive scale.
Urea.
It's a the state and its academics burn your history books and dismantle your indigenous governance. Then, when you fight back based on established international law, they use peer-reviewed academic jargon to label you an extremist or an ungovernable savage. They literally just use the old colonial tropes, just dressed up in modern sociology.
And the danger of that labeling cannot be overstated. As the author points out, it provides the state with the intellectual and moral justification to deploy military force against civilians.
Because they're fighting terrorists now.
Exactly. If you are fighting a legitimate liberation movement, you are an oppressor. But if academics have successfully labeled that movement as extremist tribalism, then any violence the state uses is suddenly justified as simply preserving the peace.
Preserving the modern state.
Right. Which brings us to the third mode the paper brings up. And I have to admit, the phrasing is really interesting, the liberal imperialist synthesis.
Yeah, I started out this phrase for a while in the outline. It sounds like an oxymoron. I need you to break this down for me. How can liberal concepts, things we usually associate with freedom, be imperialist?
It is a brilliant paradox to unpack. The paper says these scholars, many of whom are embedded in Western academic institutions, they weaponize Western liberal concepts like democratization, federalism, or conflict resolution. But they use them strictly within the framework of preserving the existing empire's borders.
So they use the vocabulary of liberation to enforce the status quo.
Exactly. When these scholars propose federalism as a solution to the Oromo question, they are acting as a conduit for Euro-American soft power. They offer solutions that sound incredibly progressive to Western policymakers, but the prerequisite for that federalism is accepting the imperial borders as non-negotiable.
I see.
It ensures the core issue, genuine Oromo self-determination and decolonization, is never actually addressed. They are pacifying the population, not liberating them.
Okay, that brings up a huge point of causality for me. Why does the Abyssinian elite even need these academics doing this?
What do you mean?
Well, if the state controls the military, the economy, and the land, why do they care what a scholar sitting in a university office writes about federalism?
Because the state doesn't exist in a vacuum. As the text argues, these scholars act as the crucial translators between domestic regimes and global superpowers.
Translators.
Yeah, the Abyssinian state needs foreign capital, foreign weapons, and diplomatic cover to survive.
And the Horn of Africa is highly strategic.
Extremely.
It's near crucial shipping lanes. It's heavily monitored by global powers.
Right. The Western geopolitical apparatus views a stable, unified Ethiopian state as absolutely essential for controlling the Horn of Africa and preventing regional fragmentation.
Okay.
So the mercenary label, the author insists, denotes a structural alignment with this Western neo-colonial interest.
So these scholars are essentially acting as international lobbyists in academic tweed.
That's a great way to picture it.
They aren't just writing for other historians, they are writing for policymakers in Washington and London.
That's the translation process. They take a domestic, local demand for decolonization from the Oromo people, and they repackage it for Western ears as a global security threat.
Wow.
By convincing Western policymakers that Oromo liberation would lead to the collapse of the Ethiopian state and subsequent regional chaos, they achieve something vital for the regime.
They secure the bag.
Yeah, exactly.
If you convince a superpower that giving the Oromo autonomy will create a haven for terrorism or regional instability, The diplomatic doors just fly open, and the financial aid pours in.
Precisely. They successfully lobby for the resources that, in the author's words, incarcerates the Oromo nation.
That perfectly demonstrates the neocolonial aspect of the paper's title.
It really does.
The physical colonizer might not be a European power directly ruling the land anymore, but the intellectual framework that justifies the subjugation and the financial backing that enforces it are deeply tied to Western imperial agendas.
Yeah, the structure remains intact.
Let's bring this down to the ground level as we move toward the end of our dive here.
Sure.
We've talked about superpowers, regional stability, academic literature, but the paper also zooms in on the micro-level impact. What does this mean for an individual Oromo citizen today, specifically someone trying to navigate the education system?
This is perhaps the most tragic element of the author's analysis. The paper describes the state education system not as an engine of opportunity, but as an alienating apparatus.
Walk me through that, because normally you think of education as the great equalizer. You want a better life, you go to school, you get a degree.
Right.
And the paper acknowledges that academic credentials, like a certificate or a diploma, are absolute prerequisites for survival in a state-dominated economy. You need that piece of paper to get a job, to feed your family, to have any upward mobility.
But look at the mechanics of how you get that paper. That certificate is a double-edged sword. To earn it, the Oromo student must pass exams and write essays that conform to the state's narrative.
Oh, man.
They must assimilate into an imperial culture that actively necessitates the erasure of their own identity.
Imagine the psychological toll of that. You go to university to better your community, only to find out the admission price is validating the people who erased your history.
Yeah.
You have to write papers celebrating the unification of your people, knowing your grandparents called it a violent conquest. You have to memorize dates that completely ignore the 𝐷ADA system.
And this creates what the author powerfully terms dishonest certificate holders.
Dishonest certificate holders.
Yes. These are brilliant Oromo intellectuals who have been forced to trade their intellectual autonomy for institutional proximity and basic economic survival.
They survived the system, they got the prestige, but the system took their voice.
Yes. By validating the state's narratives to get their credentials, they lose the ability to speak truth to power. And the structural consequence of this is profound. It creates a massive leadership vacuum.
Because the very people who have the brilliance, the research skills, the education to articulate the Oromo struggle on a global stage, they're trapped.
Exactly.
The author notes that instead of leading the liberation, these co-opted intellectuals are busy drafting the legal and economic frameworks for their own people's suppression. It is a devastating, almost perfectly designed trap.
The author refers to this dynamic as a form of sophistry designed to obscure the structural violence of the regime. The smartest minds of the colonized are absorbed by the colonizer to build the walls of the ideological enclosure even higher.
Which brings us to the core thesis of the paper. The author concludes that the Oromo struggle isn't just about dismantling physical borders or overthrowing a government. It fundamentally requires overcoming epistemicide.
Yes.
It requires subverting an intellectual hegemony.
Genuine liberation, according to the text, is an epistemic pursuit just as much as a territorial one. It demands the decoupling of intellectual rigor from state-sanctioned credentialism.
You can't just fight the physical empire. You have to decolonize the mind first. You have to cultivate an indigenous Oromo intelligentsia that treats their own experience, their own oral histories, and frameworks like the 𝐷ADA system as sovereign, legitimate epistemology.
Exactly.
They shouldn't have to be translated or validated by the state or the West to be considered real knowledge.
And again, to remind you, as we wrap up, we are just imparting the profound and highly critical arguments laid out by the author of this paper.
Right.
We aren't taking a stance on the underlying historical or political conflicts ourselves, but rather exploring the mechanics of the author's critique.
Absolutely. But analyzing these mechanics leaves us with an incredible amount to chew on. How knowledge is produced, who gets to legitimize it, and whose voices are silenced in the process. I mean, that impacts all of us, regardless of where we live.
It certainly does. And it leaves me with a final thought for you to mull over, building on the text's intense critique of credentialism.
Let's hear it.
If, as this author so passionately argues, State-sanctioned education and academic certificates can be so effectively used as tools of assimilation, erasure, and political suppression in this specific context.
Yeah.
How much of what we universally accept as objective historical truth worldwide is simply the successful, unquestioned, discursive labor of the dominant power's own mercenary scholars?
Wow. If the textbook is a weapon, how heavily should we really trust the certificates hanging on our own experts' walls?
It's a question worth asking every time you read a definitive account of history.
It really makes you look at those solid black lines on the political map a whole lot differently, doesn't it? They aren't just borders drawn on the earth, they are borders drawn in the mind. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.